The silence on the Oregon Trail had a different weight, a dust-choked promise that clung to your spine even before dawn broke. You woke to a sky the color of faded denim, stretching endlessly like some cruel joke, the sun already baking the cracked earth beneath your worn boots. Somewhere a wagon creaked, a long, mournful groan trying to convince itself it might survive another day. Around you, the scent of burnt campfire and dry grass hung heavy, mingling with the ever-present grit coating your teeth, your tongue, your dry lips. You tried to steady your trembling hands as you checked the battered wooden wheel, knowing this ritual repeated itself more times than you'd care to count. Off in the distance, the faint bleat of a stubborn goat broke the monotonous drone, the small chaos in the relentless sameness. If losing your phone battery feels like the end of the world now, imagine staring helplessly as your last ox stumbled on the trail, swallowed by the merciless dust. You hadn't seen much besides this endless horizon for weeks. Every morning blurred into the next, waking, coaxing weary oxen, patching torn canvas, rationing the stale, sometimes dirt-speckled food that barely pushed back hunger. Whispered stories circulated among weary travelers about willow bark, a crude remedy for the aches that refuse to fade. But no one spoke much about scurvy or dysentery. They were the hushed threats that picked off the weakest. Yet sometimes, at dusk, around the dying embers, a flicker of hope sparked. Laughter bubbled quietly as someone played a cracked harmonica, the warmth of human breath and shared endurance, softening the cold bite of uncertainty. But solace was fleeting. One evening, the wagon ahead shuddered violently. The sudden snap of a broken axle shattered the fragile calm. Murmurs rippled through the campfire light, weary faces turning toward each other with a shared dread you felt deep in your gut. This wasn't just bad luck. It was the spiral tightening. Supplies would dwindle faster now, and the road wouldn't slow for anyone. You caught a glimpse of the group, their movements stiff with exhaustion. The low murmur of curses blended with the crackle of dry logs. Eyes briefly meeting yours with a mix of desperation and unspoken questions. Would today be the day the trail finally claimed another victim? Hey, before Morpheus truly claims you, make sure you're still subscribed. For some, the button disappeared, and I don't want you missing the next sleepy stories. Take a soft like a pillow's hug. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? Your interaction keeps this quiet corner alive. Thanks for being part of it. The night carried its own weight, heavier than the dust now settling on your worn blanket. The crack of a twig, far too sharp and close, stirred something primal. A reminder that the Oregon Trail didn't just test your body, but clawed at the edges of your sanity. The fire flickered weakly, shadows twisting like restless ghosts across the ochre canvas of tents. You pulled your coat tighter, the fabric rough against your skin, still stained with dirt and sweat from the endless days. The smell of smoke was thick, but underneath it lay another scent, something sour, like forgotten decay, the subtle signature of illness making its quiet rounds. No one spoke of it. It was the kind of thing you only recognized when it settled in the hollow ache behind your eyes, or the sudden cough that rattled with more urgency than you dared admit. Your gaze drifted to the broken wagon down the trail. The wooden axle was now a crude splint of twisted branches and strips of rawhide, held together by stubborn hands refusing to admit defeat. The night had swallowed the sounds of repair, grunts of effort, whispered curses, wheels scraping and settling against the stubborn earth. That wagon was a small fortress of hope and despair, a testament to how far you'd come and how little remained. A sharp wind swept through the camp, carrying with it the dry cry of a distant coyote. The sound slipped through the thinnest layers of your shelter, making the shadows on the nearby trees flicker as if alive. It was the kind of night that made every snap of a branch feel like an accusation, every sigh of the wind a warning whispered just out of reach. You sat up, rubbing your sore neck, the stiff muscles complaining with each movement. The firelight danced over the tired faces gathered close, some asleep, others staring silently into the black. The silence between them was as loud as the crackling logs, a shared exhaustion that bound you all tighter than any spoken word. The rationed biscuits, stale and smeared with a smear of molasses from a tin that shook with half-empty promise, rested heavy in your stomach. Hunger was a dull ache now, something familiar and creeping, comforting in its predictability. It was the thump of your heart you worried about, not the growls. From the far edge of camp came a soft laugh, brittle and brief, a momentary crack in the brittle facade. Someone had found a tune on a battered harmonica and was coaxing out notes that wove gently through the night air. It was a fragile thread of beauty, considering the vast desolation surrounding you. A reminder that even here, among the dust and despair, there was life pushing stubbornly upward. Your eyes traced the outlines of the other. Wagons, their patched sails stirring against the chill. Each one carried a story heavier than the last, tied together like knots in a rope, fraying at both ends. You thought about the man whose wagon had broken, how he'd cursed into the dark, how his hands had trembled as he worked. There was no room for weakness here. Dawn, when it came, would bring the same brutal sun, baking the cracked earth and draining what little moisture remained. The oxen would be yoked again, their weary breaths pluming in the thickening heat, dragging loads that felt heavier with every mile. But tonight, the only weight was the silence, thick as the dust that coated your face, settling in every crevice like a cold secret. You shifted, the dry crackle of your clothes, the only sound you dared make. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled faintly, an odd, haunting sound that didn't belong here, at least not yet. Your pulse quickened, heart echoing the rhythm of that lonely chime. The men gathered closer, their whispers low and urgent. There was talk of the trail ahead, the bad stretch where the river ran shallow, the earth cracked so deep it threatened to swallow wheels whole. Someone mentioned the illness creeping among the fallen, the way it could strike a man down, silent and unseen. You swallowed hard, the bitter taste of fear crawling up your throat. It was a silence that pressed in, that clenched your chest and whispered lies of the next disaster waiting just beyond the horizon. You looked at the cracked harmonica. Again, the faint music wavering, a fragile sound caught between hope and despair. The night held its breath, waiting, and then, from the farthest edge of the camp, a sudden scream shattered the fragile quiet. It was sharp, ragged, a sound no traveler wanted to hear. Heads snapped toward the noise, eyes wide in the firelight. The shadows seemed to pull back, revealing silhouettes moving hurriedly toward the dark. Somewhere deep inside, you knew this scream wasn't just fear. It was the trail's unforgiving claim, a promise that the journey was far from over. The fire flickered once more, throwing long, quivering shadows across the dirt as the distant sounds grew closer. Shuffling feet, desperate voices, and then silence. You gripped your coat tighter, breath held, waiting for what would come next. The scream vanished quickly, swallowed by the vast blackness that stretched beyond the flickering firelight. But the echo lingered, tethered to the electric tension tangling in the cold night air. You straightened, muscles stiff and face drawn tight, the fire's glow sketching sharp shadows that seemed to hesitate, uncertain whether to retreat or confront the dark. Around you, the camp stirred, hushed voices, hurried footsteps, the scrape of boots on dry earth. The broken wagon's makeshift splint now seemed precarious, a fragile bandage on a wound that had barely begun to fester. The sense of shared dread tightened like a noose. You could feel it coil around each breath, each glance tossed between the weary travelers, their exhaustion deepening into something raw and unspoken. Tonight, the silence wasn't just the absence of sound. It was a beast lurking just behind the trees, waiting, watching. Your gaze settled on the dim shape of the man who owned the broken wagon. His shoulders trembled, not from the cold, but from something far heavier. Yet, even now, there was no surrender in his hands, only the stubborn rhythms of survival. Each knot tied with cracked leather, each whispered curse swallowed under ragged breaths, was a defiance of the trail's slow, relentless claim. A sudden gust swept through the camp, rustling the canvas tents and tugging at the smoldering embers. The smoke curled upward like spectral fingers searching for a lost sky, carrying with it the bitter scent of dry leaves and earth. A scent so familiar it felt almost like home. You draw in the night air cautiously, the grit cement in your throat, the stinging sensation a harsh reminder of just how far this journey had worn you down. Somewhere beyond, the coyote's mournful call sliced through the quiet. It rolled over the hills, a hollow lament that felt less like nature and more like a soundtrack for the despair pressing close. You knelt, brushing dust from your worn boots, the leather cracked and peeling. The firelight caught a glint on your skin, a streak of dried sweat mixed with deep grime. Every inch of you was marked by the trail, that cruel tapestry woven from days that bled into nights, without mercy or ease. The man beside you shifted, breaking the spell of silence with a low, weary chuckle. Clumsily, he produced the cracked harmonica. The first notes were frail, trembling against the oppressive quiet, but soon a fleeting melody took shape, broken and beautiful. It wrapped around the camp like a whispered secret, fragile but defiant. For a brief moment, the weight of dust and despair lifted. Faces softened, eyes flickered with something like hope. It was the briefest reprieve you could remember, the human spirit clawing its way through the endless gray. But even as the music breathed life between shadows, your mind was pulled back to the dark edges just beyond the firelight. The scream had been a sharp crack in the night's fragile peace, a brutal reminder that no melody lasted forever here. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the gloom, stumbling with urgency that spoke loud and clear above the harmonica's fading notes. His face was pale under the moonlight, eyes wide, hands trembling, as he approached the circle of warmth and weary life. They found her, he gasped, voice raw like the dusty throat he struggled to clear. Out by the river, near the old crossing. A cold shiver slithered up your spine. The river crossing was a dreaded place, infamous in every tale whispered around campfires and etched into every travel-worn map. Shallow now, the water trickling thin and sluggish, but the land there was treacherous. Deep cracks like gaping wounds where wagons had vanished, and the sick, well, they tended to vanish too. You caught the sharp, haunted looks exchanged between others. No one spoke the name, but you all knew what it meant. A body, a new casualty to the dust and sickness. A hush fell again, heavier now. The fire shrank to a pitiful glow, barely holding back the sprawling darkness, as if it understood how easily the fragile bonds here could snap. Someone began to murmur a prayer under their breath, low and steady, trying to stitch courage where none remained. You swallowed the lump in your throat and rubbed the rough fabric of your coat, the coarse fibers grounding you against a tide of rising panic. Your eyes scanned the horizon just beyond the firelight, where shadows writhed and shifted uneasily. The silence seemed alive, thickened with secrets and losses too heavy for words. With deliberate calm, the leader of the group stood, his face carved by sleepless nights and harsh days, expression grim but resolute. "We move at first light," he said, voice barely louder than the crackling fire. There's no waiting here. Every minute lost drags us closer to the end. No one argued. They never did. You felt the weight of that truth settle deep in your bones. For now, the night swallowed the camp again. But you knew this fragile peace was only a breath, a pause before the trail demanded more. The harmonica lay silent now, abandoned on a log, its cracked surface catching the faint glow of dying embers. You lay back on your rough blanket, eyes tracing the stars obscured somewhere far above the dusty sky. The wind whispered secrets through the leaves, carrying warnings you couldn't quite decipher. As your breath slowed and the fire's warmth ebbed, a distant sound drifted faintly, a low rumble like the earth itself groaning beneath. The dust, or maybe it was something else. Something moving. You clenched your jaw against the sudden chill, heart hammering in the stillness, waiting to see what the darkness would bring next. The shadows clung tighter now, as if the night itself was reluctant to let go of the fear freshly born from that scream. You felt it prickling along your skin, the kind of chill that the thinnest blanket can't chase away. The fire had shriveled low, its orange tongues licking the blackened logs with a tired, hesitant glow. Around you, the camp shifted uneasily, the murmurs barely above the desperate sighs of the wind, threading through barren branches. The man from the broken wagon wiped a hand across his face, smearing the dirt and sweat, like a futile attempt to wash away more than just grime. His eyes darted toward the edge where the panic had burst, cheeks hollow, breath shallow. No one needed to say it aloud. Each traveler knew what lurked in those whispered rumors, the silent thief who came with the dust and heat, seizing bodies without warning. You pulled your coat tighter, the rough fabric biting into your skin, trying to keep the invisible weight of dread at bay. Around the camp, the scent of smoke mingled reluctantly with something fouler, a sharp, rot-tinged tang that made your stomach twist. It was the invisible visitor among you, the curse that had begun its quiet rounds. Somewhere close, a dog's low growl broke the fragile calm, followed by the scuffle of hurried footsteps. Faces turned sharply, eyes wide in the smoldering firelight. A woman appeared, her gait unsteady, lips trembling as words spilled from her lips like dry leaves in a storm. She's gone, found by the river, cold, and with that look. Her voice cracked, swallowed by the heavy air as a hush fell over the camp. Silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. You caught the glint of eyes reflecting flames, each burning with its own knot of fear and exhaustion. The river crossing had become a graveyard in the sun, a place where hope dried up faster than the parched earth beneath. No one wanted to speak of the body, yet all knew it meant the trail was closer to breaking them than ever. The leader, the one whose face carried both grit and gravitas, stepped into the meager light. His voice was low, a rumble that echoed in the hollow spaces between stars. We can't linger here. At first light, we move again. This road doesn't forgive waiting. His gaze swept across the circle. A silent oath passed between them all. You glanced at the harmonica lying forgotten on a log, its cracked edges catching the fire's last flickers. The melody that had once lifted spirits was swallowed by heavier shadows. It seemed almost cruel, how hope could tease you before retreating behind despair's veil. The night deepened, swallowing the camp in its implacable embrace. Your breathing slowed, though the ache in your chest refused to relent. Somewhere in the distance, a train of clouds stretched across the sky, dull and ghostly, like smudges on faded fabric. The wind carried with it stories that you couldn't quite grasp, whispers from the dust, secrets of those who had vanished before you. The fire cracked suddenly, a brief flare that cast dancing shapes on the canvas walls. You caught sight of a figure slipping away from the group, their steps careful against the gravel, silhouette blurred and uncertain. Something about the movement pulled your attention, a hesitation, a furtive glance back over a shoulder. Curiosity battled with fatigue. Your fingers brushed the worn leather of your satchel, tracing the edges of a small journal tucked inside, the only record of this grueling journey, beyond frayed memories and whispered tales. A faint crack echoed behind you. You turned sharply, eyes scanning the brush, but found only shifting shadows and the distant silhouette of a scraggly tree battered by restless wind. The silence returned swiftly, heavier than before. In that moment, your thoughts snapped to the river, cold, silent, marked by forgotten cracks. The place where the trail had swallowed more than wagons. A place where the sick disappeared, carried away by something darker than the sun-grilled earth. Around the camp, the murmurs resumed, low and urgent. Words like fever, smell, and stiffness drifted through the firelight. A man nearby coughed harshly, the rasp echoing like a broken whistle. You swallowed, imagining the invisible enemy lugging itself closer with every breath they drew. A sudden breeze swept through the camp, stirring the dry grass and old canvas tents. The scent of earth and smoke gave way momentarily to something colder, like the breath of winter teasing the edges of an endless summer. You shivered, pulling your coat tighter, heart hammering against ribs that felt too fragile for the burden they carried. The stolen moment of peace shattered abruptly as a sharp cry ripped through the air again, this time from just beyond the line of wagons. Heads jerked toward the sound, and the group stiffened as one. Footsteps thundered in the dust, hurried and uneven. The leader's voice cut through the tension. Stay close, don't scatter. You moved instinctively, following the convergence of figures forming tightly around the source of the chaos. A boy, no older than a handful of seasons, panic etched into the dirt on his face. He clutched something small and trembling, something too fragile to carry such weight. It moved, he stammered, eyes impossibly wide. Near the river, something alive, but wrong. His voice faltered, swallowed by the tightening grip of unseen fear. You swallowed hard, the grit in your throat thickening. The fire sputtered, casting long, quivering shadows that seemed ready to crawl off the ground. The night was no longer simply dark. It was a veil concealing threats that blurred the edges between the living and the dying. The group's circle shrank closer, whispers weaving with the dry crackle of fading embers. No one questioned the boy's words. Not really. Because out here, on this endless dust-swept road, the line between survival and surrender twisted thin. A quiet breath escaped you, mingling with the scent of earth and smoke. The trail ahead was no longer just a path through the wilderness, but a shadowed corridor where unseen eyes waited patiently. And somewhere, just beyond the glint of firelight, the slow, deliberate scrape of something moving slipped over the cracked earth, a sound without shape, without flesh, but heavy with promise. You met the darkness with a steady breath, knowing that dawn would not bring relief. It would bring reckoning. The night thickened its cloak, wrapping the camp in a suffocating hush. Your breath fogged in the cold air, a fragile puff that vanished quickly, swallowed by the vast blackness, pressing close like a living thing. Around you, faces lingered near the dwindling fire, eyes hollow but alert, every creak and snap outside twisting the tension into something almost unbearable. The boy's words still tumbled in your mind. It moved, something alive, but wrong. You tried to push the image away, but the darkness beyond held no mercy. It was a place where the mind played tricks, where every shadow lengthened into an approaching nightmare. From the edge of the camp came a soft rustle, urgent but cautious. You shifted, heart tightening as a slender figure slipped between tents, merging with the flickering light and the lingering smoke. It was the leader, his face drawn tight, jaw clenched against exhaustion, and whatever haunted thoughts lurked just beneath the surface. He moved to the broken wagon, kneeling beside the crude splint, with hands still steady despite the weight of hopelessness threading through the night. His fingers brushed leather and wood, worn, cracked, barely holding their fragile covenant of survival. A small, bitter smile cracked the lines of his face, a moment caught between defiance and despair. Behind him, murmurs rose quietly, stories half-spoken, of strange sightings near the river, fever glow in pale faces, whispers of stiffened limbs that no salve or willow bark soothed. You felt a shiver carve down your spine, the scent of decay sharper now, riding the gusts that slipped through the canvas like secrets spilled among the tired. You pulled your coat tighter, the scratchy fabric, a poor shield against the chill settling deep in your bones. The staleness of the camp's air mixed with something fouler, something that didn't belong, but had claimed a foothold. You glanced around, eyes catching the worn features of travelers bent under invisible burdens, each one gripping to hope like a last ember in the ashes. The dog growled low again, this time more urgent, a ripple of unease shaking the circle. The fire's glow sputtered, but refused to die, its reluctant dance casting giant shadows that climbed and leapt with every whisper of wind. Somewhere just beyond, the trees seemed to lean closer, branches scraping together in a muted warning. You didn't want to think what waited behind those shadows. The stories were enough. Of men disappearing, of the sick vanishing near the old crossing, swallowed by a place where the earth groaned and split open like the gaping maw of some ancient beast. The river's trickle now was more a sigh than a flow, winding sluggish and shallow, mocking each trembling step taken toward it. A sudden breeze rattled the tents, carrying a faint, bitter scent that made your stomach twist. It was the unmistakable tang of sickness, stale, unmoving, and crawling beneath the skin like cold fire. You swallowed hard, licking your cracked lips dry, tasting the dust tang that coated everything. Somewhere close, the faintest sound betrayed movement. Soft footfalls, hurried but careful, cutting through the night's silent curse. You turned swiftly, catching sight of a figure hurrying between wagons. A woman, her face pale and streaked with dirt, moved with a desperate grace, clutching a bundle wrapped in faded cloth. Her steps faltered as she neared the circle of light, voice breaking as she spoke. They found another by the river. It wasn't just the sickness this time. You, along with the others, held your breath. The phrase hung, thick and heavy, pressing down like a lead weight on the chest. The woman's eyes glistened, shadows of harsh truths crossing her face, a silent confession. None dared voice. The leader straightened, voice low and steady, despite the tremor of grim news. We can't linger here. The trail won't wait for grief. His gaze swept the weary group, catching yours for a moment, a flicker of shared understanding in the gathering darkness. No one argued, none had the strength. The promise etched in the dry earth beneath your boots was clear: move forward or be swallowed. The fire sputtered, casting a faint glow over the forgotten harmonica lying abandoned on the log. Its cracked surface caught the dying ember's light one last time, a fading echo of laughter and fragile hope. You traced the worn leather of your satchel, absent-mindedly, fingers brushing the edges of the small journal inside. Records of this relentless journey, etched in ink and dust. A strangled whistle cut through the night, the mournful call of a coyote somewhere beyond the ragged hills. A lone testament to the wildness that hadn't yet been tamed by man's endless march. The sound stirred something primal, an echo of survival and loss tangled together. Suddenly, movement caught your eye, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper black, separate from the group, moving with hesitation and purpose. A man, older, gaunt, shoulders stooped, as if the very weight of the trail rested there, pressed his hands against the ribs of a wagon, blinking into the dark. His lips moved in silent resolve before he straightened, voice a rough whisper. "We've seen the signs. The sickness gnaws at our edges. It's coming closer." The words fell like stones, sinking into the brittle air. Around you, the camp shifted, a breath held tight against the inevitable. Your senses sharpened, the faint scrape of claws on dry earth, a breeze that smelled wrong, colder than it should be in this dusty hell. The tension coiled tighter inside the circle of flickering flames, a silent agreement that the night's fragile peace was fractured beyond repair. You turned back toward the fire, feeling the heat one last time before stepping into the shadowed quiet beyond. The path ahead stretched endless beneath a shroud of stars, each mile a test of grit, worn thin by dust and despair. And then, just as your pulse slowed and your breath steadied, the sound crept forward again, a slow, deliberate dragging just at the edge of hearing, something moving with patient purpose across the cracked earth. You stopped, the cold gripping your gut. The land held its breath, and somewhere in the blackness beyond the distant firelight, a pair of eyes blinked open, watching, waiting. The trail was far from finished with you yet. The cold bit sharper as dawn hinted at the horizon, a faint bruising purple that threatened to bleed into everything. You sat on a jagged rock, the sting of its rough surface seeping through your threadbare coat. Around you, the wagons had stirred, the creak of wheels and low murmurs threading through the quiet dawn like a fragile prayer. The cracked harmonica lay abandoned, its faded notes still hanging in the silent morning. The weight of last night's news pressed heavy on your chest, the body found by the river, the whispers of the creeping sickness, the cold stare of that boy's terror. The land around the old crossing was not just cracked earth and shallow water. It was a shrine to all the lost hopes swallowed beneath the relentless dust. A thin wind pulled at the ragged canvas of your shelter, carrying with it that same sour trace of decay that had haunted the camp. You pulled your coat tighter, tasting the grit on your cracked lips, a dry bitterness that matched the dust settling into your throat. The outside world felt impossibly vast, but suffocatingly close all at once. A cruel paradox that made every breath a small victory. The leader's shadow moved through the campfire's embers, his silhouette doubled by another figure, an old man with eyes sharp as flint, fingers twitching like a broken clock. They whispered urgently in low tones, the kind of talk you couldn't quite hear, but sensed carried the weight of final decisions and worn-out fears. The wagons creaked, each groan a tired complaint against the strain of the path, their sails patched with stubborn hope and fraying resilience. Beyond, The oxen huddled in restless clusters, their breaths thick in the chill morning air. You watched, the dull ache in your joints sharpening with the thought of another day, dragging the already bled-out beasts across the broken trail. Your gaze drifted to the river crossing once more. The cracked soil stretched toward the sluggish water, like a wound refusing to heal. An open scar marked by every lost traveler, every shattered dream. In the faint morning light, the mangled remains of a wagon wheel lay half-buried, a mute testament to the trail's merciless appetite. Voices began to unravel around you, hushed but edged with urgency. The sickness wasn't just stealing lives quietly anymore. It was creeping into the camp, clawing at limbs and stealing strength. You spotted a woman near the fire, her face pale and drawn, coughing harshly with a rattling desperation that held notes of finality. Her eyes locked with yours for a brief instant, the unspoken message hanging between you like a spinning blade. If the trail was a beast, it was hungry, and the sickness was its sharpest tooth. Yet despite the growing dread, a flicker of defiance lit the encampment. Someone had found a battered fiddle and was coaxing a slow, plaintive melody from it. The strings quivered against the silence, each note a fragile thread holding the world together. For a heartbeat, the dust-filled air seemed to soften, memories of better times flickering across faces lined with exhaustion. You swallowed the lump growing in your throat, wiping a stray bead of sweat despite the chill. The fire sputtered, sending sparks into the brightening sky like tiny beacons. A few travelers stirred, rubbing stiff muscles, eyes scanning the horizon as if daring the dawn to break faster. The leader approached, his face carved from days without rest, surrounded now by a quiet crowd. His voice was low, but carried a steel edge as he addressed the group. We move with the sun. No wandering, no extra stops. The trail doesn't wait for those who linger behind. Whispers rippled, the fragile fabric of resolve stretching thinner with every word. You caught a glimpse of the old wagon's owner, muscles taut, fingers working silently to reinforce the splint that now barely held. His eyes met yours, sharp, tired, but burning with a stubborn light. The day ahead was a gauntlet. The sun would bake the earth with cruel intensity, every mile a draining death march, thinly veiled by hope. The river crossing would swallow more than wheels this time, its cracked bed a grave marker for dreams deferred. Your pulse quickened with a sudden, almost instinctual chill. Somewhere beyond the circle of firelight, the wind slipped through dry grass and scattered leaves, carrying a new sound. Something slow, something deliberate. You squinted toward the edge of the camp where shadows clustered, thick and uneasy. The dark seemed to breathe, twisting and recoiling like a living thing, waiting for its moment. A soft scrape, almost imperceptible but unmistakable, slid across the dirt. The group tensed, breaths caught between hope and fear. And then, clear as the breaking day, a whisper reached your ears, too faint for anyone else, yet loud enough for your mind to grasp. The trail's claim was not done. It was only beginning. The first tentative light of dawn bled faintly over the horizon, a pale bruise against the endless sky. You pulled your coat tighter, the rough fabric scratching your neck, still tasting the sour tang of decay lingering in the cold morning air. Around you, the camp stirred with the whispered murmurs of those bracing for the day ahead, eyes heavy, bodies aching, each breath a brittle thread holding them to this unforgiving trail. The wagons groaned as old wheels shifted against the dry soil, reluctant to start anew. Somewhere near, the broken axle was inspected again, the crude splint of branches and rawhide tested by trembling hands, unwilling to surrender. You could almost feel the tension in the air, thick and unyielding, as if the very earth beneath you held its breath, waiting for the inevitable. A faint rustle stirred the grass beyond the camp's edge. The sickly sweetness of decay clung to the breeze, an unwelcome reminder of the shadow sinking ever closer. You swallowed hard, tasting grit and blood at the back of your throat, a thin film of exhaustion clouding your somewhere. A low cough cut through the dawn's fragile quiet, a sharp, desperate sound that rattled past hushed prayers and hopeful silences alike. The leader's voice broke the stillness, quiet but steel-edged. We move as soon as the sun climbs high. No delays. The trail isn't patient. His eyes, weathered and sharp, flicked to the scattered faces around the flames and met yours for a fleeting moment. In that glance, you saw the weight of countless miles, of losses unspoken but deeply felt. Your gaze drifted toward the river crossing once more. The cracked earth yawned wide, clefts like open wounds scarring the land. The water was sluggish now, a mere trickle, mocking the traveler's thirst and dread. You thought of the body found there, cold and silent, final, grim punctuation on this unrelenting journey. A soft, melancholy melody arose, played on a battered fiddle by a man whose calloused fingers trembled with fatigue, yet refused to yield. The notes floated over the campsite, fragile threads of hope tangled with sorrow. For a heartbeat, the dust-choked world seemed to breathe, if only briefly, beneath that faint song. But no comfort could linger. Among the crowd, a woman coughed again, harsher this time. Her pale face flicked toward you, eyes sunken but fierce in their desperation. You offered a silent nod, a small exchange in a world where words were often too heavy to bear. Near the fire, an old man whispered urgent words to the leader, their faces drawn tight as they exchanged grim news. The sickness wasn't simply a cruel shadow anymore. It was encroaching, gnawing at the edges of their fragile caravan. You clenched your fists, the rough leather of your satchel biting into your palm. The trail stretched ahead, endless and merciless. But it was the invisible enemy that haunted this place more than the cracked earth or the blistering sun. Suddenly, movement flickered at the camp's edge. A figure emerged from the shadows. Old, gaunt, shoulders stooped under the weight of unseen burdens. He pressed a trembling hand against a wagon wheel, then straightened, eyes dark pools of resolve and fear. "It's coming," he whispered. "We've seen the signs. The sickness. It's closer than we thought." The words sank heavily, pulling the camp's weary breath tighter into a shared silence. A sudden gust swept the tents, scattering embers. Into the pinking sky, the fire sputtered, fighting desperately to keep its hold against the encroaching dawn. The sweet, sour breath of sickness mingled with smoke and dust, an invisible fog, wrapping the camp in its chilling embrace. Your ears caught it then, a slow, scraping sound on the parched earth, soft and deliberate. A whisper from the darkness that made every hair on your arms rise. The shadows wriggled uneasy, twisting away as if alive, recoiling from some unseen presence crossing the threshold of their fragile refuge. The boy's terrified words echoed faintly in your mind. It moved, something alive, but wrong. You swallowed the lump in your throat, tasting the bitterness of fear, more bitter than any hunger gnawing inside you. Figures shifted uneasily around the fire as the scraping sound grew, a patient, dragging noise, without shape or breath, but heavy with something relentlessly watching. You glanced at the forgotten harmonica, its cracked shell catching the last flickers of flame. Once it had sung hope into the night. Now it lay silent, like a relic buried beneath the weight of dust and despair. With a sudden clarity, you caught a distant gleam, eyes low to the ground, reflecting the first rays of the sun, watching, waiting. The trail was far from done with you. The first rays of dawn crept hesitantly over the horizon, a pale wash of bruised purple bleeding into the cracked sky. You settled your weight onto a jagged stone, the rough surface biting into your worn coat, its threads fraying just like the edges of your patience. Around you, the camp stirred with the heavy movements of men and women, bracing for another merciless day. The wagons creaked low, a chorus of exhaustion mingling with the whispered murmurs, threading through the brittle morning air. Your eyes drifted once more to the broken wagon, its splintered axle barely held by splints of twisted branches and knotted rawhide. The man who claimed it moved with slow determination, his calloused hands testing their fragile work, despite the weight of hopelessness looming like a storm cloud. Every crack in the wood, every tense muscle spoke of the trail's relentlessness, how fragile hope had become. A faint rustle stirred the dry grass beyond camp's edge. The air carried that same sour trace of decay, relentless and bitter, curling like smoke through your nostrils. You swallowed hard, tasting grit and desperation in your throat, as a harsh cough cracked the quiet, a desperate rasp slicing through hesitant prayers and solemn silences. The leader's voice broke the dawn's stillness with measured steel. "We move once the sun pierces high. No stopping, no wandering," he said, his shadow long and jagged as it passed among the tired faces. His gaze met yours for a fleeting moment, the silent pact between souls, threadbare and weary. Move forward or be swallowed. The river crossing yawned ahead, shattered earth speckled with deep fissures like fresh wounds. The water was little more than a feeble trickle, mocking your thirst and darkening dread. The remnant of a broken wagon wheel lay half-buried in cracked dirt, mute evidence of dreams consumed by dust. A battered fiddle came alive nearby, coaxed by fakers' fingers, trembling with stubborn hope. Its plaintive melody wove delicate threads of fragile beauty through the dust-choked air. For a heartbeat, the world seemed less cruel, less empty. But the ache in your chest only tightened. Near the fire, a woman coughed again, sharper, fiercer this time, her pale eyes briefly locking with yours. No words exchanged, but the message hovered between you like a blade. The sickness was no longer a shadow at the edge. It was here. Whispers cascaded around the campfire as the old man spoke urgently into the leader's ear. Sketches of fever, stiff limbs, and the silent stolen breath of the unseen enemy tore through the fragile calm. The invisible wound had begun its slow spread. The camp held its collective breath. Somewhere deep in the hungry dust, a sound emerged, soft footfalls cutting swiftly, yet carefully, through the night's suffocating silence. You turned sharply, catching glimpses of a pale figure gliding between tents, clutching a worn bundle with trembling hands and desperate grace. She faltered at the ring of firelight, voice cracking as she said, "They found another by the river, and it wasn't just the sickness this time." The words dropped like stones that shattered the dim quiet. Your throat tightened, the cold trace of fear slithering down your spine. The river crossing was more than cracked earth and shallow water. It had become a graveyard where hope darkened into shadow. The leader straightened, voice low but resolute. "We can't linger here. The trail won't wait." For grief, his gaze swept across the tired faces, resting on yours briefly, an unspoken acknowledgement of the cost yet to come. The abandoned harmonica lay near the fire, its cracked shell catching the faint flicker of embers before darkness reclaimed it. It was a relic of fragile hope, now silent beneath the weight of dust and decay. Your fingers absent-mindedly brushed your satchel's worn leather, touching the edges of a small journal, records inked in grit and whispered fears. The air shuddered with the sudden, mournful howl of a distant coyote, the sound sowing wildness back into the fragile fabric of camp. It was a reminder that the wilderness had no mercy, that the ground beyond still breathed with ancient forces unseen. From the camp's shadowy edge, a man emerged, old, gaunt, shoulders bowed beneath invisible burdens, his fingers pressed against the tired ribs of a wagon, a tremor betraying the weight he bore. His voice, a rough whisper that cut through the cooled night air, broke the fragile silence. "It's coming. The sickness. It's closer than we thought." His words sank like heavy stones into the brittle earth. Around you, the camp shifted, each breath held tight against the creeping darkness. Then, a slow, scraping sound edged in on the parched soil, patient, deliberate. It was neither wind nor beast, but something waiting, just beyond the flicker of firelight. The shadows writhed uneasily, recoiling as if breathing themselves. You turned back to the fire's fading warmth one last time before stepping into the cold quiet, heart thudding with brittle resolve. The trail stretched before you, endless, merciless, and now more haunted than ever. And then, just as your breath steadied, a pair of eyes gleamed low in the dark, unblinking, watching, waiting. The trail's claim was far from finished. The dawn's first light unraveled slowly across the cracked horizon, softening the harsh edges of the night's shadows. You lifted your heavy gaze from the rough stone you'd settled upon, feeling the sun's tentative warmth seep through the chill folding over the land. The camp stirred gently, the last embers of fire flickering fewer, their orange tongues licking the cool air with a reluctant farewell. Around you, worn faces, etched with dust and fatigue, moved with a fragile purpose. The broken wagon stood still, its crude splint no longer fresh, but weathered, much like the spirit of its owner. He knelt beside it, fingers tracing the rough bonds binding wood and branch, not quite surrendering to defeat. His eyes met yours for a moment, and in them something unspoken passed between you, a quiet acceptance of what lay ahead. The sickness, a whispered threat, fading at the campfire's edge, had become an unyielding presence. Pale faces, coughs heavy and ragged, and the cold dread that crept beneath the skin like an invisible hand. But in the soft morning light, a fragile calm had settled over the weary travelers, the kind of calm born not from hope, but from resignation and the slow courage carved by endless miles of dust and loss. You breathed in deeply, the dusty air tasting of dry earth and faint smoke mingled with that now familiar sour hint of decay. It clung to everything, clothing, skin, even the thoughts folding in your mind. Around the camp, quiet melodies wove through the stillness, a battered fiddle coaxing the barest thread of sound, almost too delicate for such a bleak morning. "Move with the sun," the leader's voice cut through softly, resolute but kind, carrying the weight of hard decisions made in the long, lonely nights. No stopping, no delays. The words settled deep, wrapping around the group like a promise and a warning. The trail held no mercy, but relinquishing it was never an option. You shifted your worn satchel, fingers grazing the edges of the small journal tucked inside. Words and sketches, marks of survival etched in ink and dust. This journey, with all its merciless truths and fading hopes, had become more than memory. It was a story carried forward by every step, weighted by grit and determination. Beyond the camp's faded warmth, the old crossing waited, a battleground marked not by triumph, but by absence. The cracked earth yawned wide, scars splitting the land like countless wounds never healed. A half-buried wheel, warped and silent, rested as a mute memorial to broken dreams. The man beside you slowly stood, stretching stiff limbs that held the imprint of exhaustion. Around you, quiet murmurs passed, the language of shared survival, fears verbal but muted, confidences born in the fragile bonds of hardship. As the first rays chased away the night's last shadows, you felt the trail at your feet, endless and unyielding. The hollow cry of a distant coyote stitched through the dawn, a reminder that the wilderness observed and endured indifferent to human will. The sick woman near the fire coughed once more, a harsh, rattling sound that fractured the fragile hope like a cracked mirror. Her eyes locked briefly with yours, fierce in their silent plea to press on, to hold on. No words were needed. The message passed between you like a breath. A gust swept the camp, stirring dust and ash around your boots. The tenor of the morning shifted, the sweet, sour scent of sickness tightening its hold. It was no longer a lurking shadow, but a reality pressing close with relentless hunger. Then, from the quiet edge of the caravan, the old man emerged once more. His presence was a fragile line drawn in the sand, his voice low but unyielding. "It's closer than we thought. The sickness, it moves faster now." The group tightened in response, whispers fading to solemn silence as the gravity of those words settled like a stone in the pit of your stomach. You swallowed hard, skin prickling with the awareness of unseen eyes still watching beyond the firelight. A faint, deliberate scrape sounded anew, soft yet impossible to ignore. The land seemed to hold its breath. Shadows twisted uneasily, as if the darkness itself recoiled. You turned toward the remaining flames, fingers brushing the harmonica, abandoned on a log nearby, its cracked body echoing memories of laughter and music now long faded away. It had sung hope once, fragile as a flicker in the wind, but the trail had turned its song into silence. Your thoughts returned to the boy's terrified words. It moved. Something alive, but wrong. The phrase lingered, fragile yet ominous, as you drew your coat tighter against the crisp morning air. The time had come to stand once more, to face the path stretching merciless and unknown. Around you, figures stirred, each body marked by the weight of miles and the quiet courage to keep moving forward despite fear's cold whisper. You stepped away from the fire's dying warmth, the rough earth cold beneath your boots. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last threads of night, laying bare the endless road ahead. The silence now felt less like emptiness and more like the breath before a reckoning. And then, through the dawn haze, a pair of eyes flickered low in the gathering light, watchful, patient, and unblinking. The trail was not done with you yet. So you breathed deep, heart steadying, and let your feet find their rhythm once again. Because even in the dust and desolation, life pushes stubbornly forward. The path may be cruel, the losses many, but the journey, this story, had found its quiet close. Now, beneath the wide open sky, wrapped in the soft embrace of morning, you allowed yourself a slow exhale. A horizon stretched, endless, but strangely serene, carrying the dust and the ghosts beyond view. And finally, with the trail behind you and the vast unknown ahead, you closed your eyes. The story settled into the earth, like dust on leather, rough, enduring, and softly fading into the stillness of a long journey concluded.